Hi, I'm Dave Glenwick, and as the acting chair of NISPA's Continuing Education Committee, it's a pleasure to present this webinar on continuing education. There are a couple of goals that I have for this webinar. The first is to provide background on the purpose of continuing education and NISPA's role in promoting continuing education, which I'll refer to as CE. And the second goal is to guide presenters through Attachment D, which is the heart of the CE application, to hopefully make it relatively easy to complete and to be able to do so with as few revisions as possible. So first, let's talk about the definition and purpose of CE. The purpose of CE is to promote lifelong learning and self-assessment of needs in order to maintain one's competence as a psychologist. So through CE, we're helping individual psychologists maintain their currency with regard to knowledge and skills. And also, we're helping to ensure the public's trust in psychology as a profession that is grounded in a solid foundation in both science and practice, and that is continually renewing itself based on ongoing developments in the field. Next, let's talk about NISPA's role in CE. NISPA is what's termed an APA-approved sponsor of CE programs, which means that we are authorized by APA to approve presentations for credit by those who wish to put on continuing education workshops. This approval is renewable, and so every few years, NISPA does have to submit a renewal application to maintain our status as an APA-approved sponsor. NISPA and its CE committee implement APA's established CE guidelines. So it's important to keep in mind that we're implementing existing guidelines. We're not creating our own. Also, as an APA-approved sponsor of CE, NISPA must submit the completed CE presenter application materials for workshops that we approve. We have to submit this material to APA's CE office periodically in order to maintain ourselves in good standing. And this is why we may at times appear picky regarding wording of what's written on the applications and the details that we're asking to be included. We need it to be right in order for NISPA to maintain its status as an APA-approved sponsor. I would emphasize that we want to and actually do approve an extremely high percentage of submissions. Approval is a win-win-win situation, which is why we try wherever possible to ultimately approve a submission. For NISPA, approved programs generate revenue and they increase the organization's profile. For presenters, approved programs increase their visibility and potential future benefits and opportunities that might arise from having presented material before as large a group as possible. And for attendees at CE presentations, approved programs increase their knowledge and skills and help satisfy CE requirements in those states that have mandatory CE. Next, let's look at what constitutes an appropriate CE presentation. There are three main questions that, as a committee, we ask ourselves when reviewing applications for CE credit. The first is the material at a postdoctoral level? there actually is some range here with regard to what can be considered postdoctoral, since what might be postdoctoral for a psychologist trained in one era, say in around 2010, might not be the same as for a psychologist trained in another era, say the 1970s or the 1980s. So there is latitude here in what can be considered postdoctoral material. So, for example, dialectic behavior therapy, DBT, for those in grad school now and going on their internship, that's probably going to be included somewhere in their training. For those who were trained in earlier decades, DBT might well constitute postdoctoral material. So we do have a good bit of freedom in what can be considered postdoctoral. The second question that we ask is the presenter qualified to present on the topic? And qualification can be demonstrated in a variety of ways, any of which are acceptable. The presenter or presenters could have publications on the topic. Perhaps they've taught courses on the subject matter at the university level. Perhaps there are previous presentations that the presenter has made to established groups and organizations. Any of these can constitute qualifications to present. Also, with regard to qualifications, I would note that the presenter need not be a psychologist and need not have a doctorate. It's the person's qualifications to present on the particular topic that is essential. The third question that we asked is, does the material to be presented conform to APA's CE criteria for CE approvable subject matter? APA has criteria regarding what is considered CE worthy. And I'll address this question in a few minutes when we discuss the program rationale section of Attachment B. Next, let's turn to Attachment B and go through its various sections. The first section of importance is entitled Program Description. Here, it's important to be as specific as possible. Describe in detail the material to be presented and the foundation, the basis for that material. The presenter should not assume that the committee members know about the content and should be as explicit and detailed as possible. The next section is headed Program Rationale. You'll see here that there are 3 boxes that can be checked off, each reflecting one of APA's 3 criteria for approved CE as of January 1st, 2016. You'll see 3 boxes indicate the first is that the content relates to psychological assessment and or intervention, for example, therapy. The second is that the program content is focused on topics related to psychological practice, education, training, or research other than assessment and intervention and therapy. And the third is that the program content is related to legal and ethical issues affecting psychology. There is an important change in these criteria from the previously existing APA criteria, and it's important to point this out. Prior to January 1st of 2016, there was a criterion that allowed material to be accepted if it was consistent and conformed to accepted theory and practice in psychology. That allowed a very wide latitude in what was acceptable. In the new criteria, APA has dropped that particular criterion. So being consistent with accepted theory and practice is no longer by itself an acceptable criterion for getting material to be approved for CE. The reason for this change is that the APA Continuing Education Office has decided to emphasize material that has what's called evidence-based support. And in the program rationale section, this has assumed increased importance. So it is vital in the program rationale section that in addition to checking off the box that's the most appropriate for your material, that in the space below that you provide evidence-based support with a minimum of 3 references for the material that you're presenting. Particularly with regard to the first 2 boxes, psychological assessment and intervention, or topics related to practice, education, training, and research, it's very important to provide evidence-based support, preferably solid research references if you're checking off those boxes. If you check off the 3rd box on legal and ethical issues, it's important to provide supporting citations regarding how the material is relevant to the practice of psychology. I would emphasize that you should check off only one of the 3 boxes. Sometimes people think that the odds of acceptance, of approval, are greater if you check off 2 or 3 of the boxes. That's not the case. More is not better. What we do want is for you to check off that box, that one box that you think is the most appropriate, and below it to provide support for that box, for that rationale. One question that's often asked is material concerning what's called by APA the business to practice approvable for CE credits? The business of practice refers to material having to do with the business side of psychology practice. For example, setting up an office, creating a system for record keeping, and for entering insurance material, things of that sort. The question is answered with that often used answer by psychologists: it depends. If the material deals with the business of practice and is concerned mainly with how to increase the financial remuneration, the economic benefits to the psychologist, to the practitioner, then the material is not approvable for CE credit. If, however, the material focuses on how to expand one's services to reach previously unserved or underserved populations, then the material is potentially approvable for CE credits. So the main focus of business of practice submissions, in order to be approved for C, is whom is benefiting by this. And one has to demonstrate that previously underserved potential client populations will benefit from the material included in the workshop. If in so doing, the service provider, the psychologist, also benefits economically, that's fine. But there does have to be a focus on the consumer here. If we move to the next section of attachment B, this is program objectives. And this is a section which does seem to create some difficulty for many presenters, which is why we have a number of examples here in attachment B as to what are acceptable and not acceptable program objectives. I would emphasize that the objectives, one, should be written from the perspective of the participant, not the presenter, and two, should contain active verbs. So it's important to keep those two things in mind, that the perspective is that of the person attending the workshop, and that the verbs should be active ones. And we provide examples here. So, for example, active verbs are words like state, describe, explain, verbalize, demonstrate, show. So the participant will be able to state, describe, explain, etc. Verbs like know, understand, learn, appreciate, become aware of, become familiar with, are not considered acceptable verbs because they're not really observable or, in theory, measurable. We provide an example at the end of the illustrations there. The participant will be able to describe two key differences between Freudian and Kleinian approaches to aggression. This is a good objective because it's observable, it uses an active verb, describe, and it's written from the perspective of the participant. Next, if we move to the section on assessment of participant learning, here we're addressing the question of how will the presenter have some idea of what was learned by the participants? And generally there are two approaches that are considered acceptable ways of assessing participant learning. The first is to have one or more explicitly scheduled Q&A periods. And this is probably the more commonly used approach to assessment. To just say that there will be a Q&A session at the end of each presentation. A second appropriate assessment method is to use post-test questions that attendees will answer at the end of the presentation. If you decide to go that route, these questions should be included in the submission in the section headed by assessment of participant learning. If one goes the route of post-test questions, it's important that the questions not be so easy as to be correctly and easily answerable without having attended the presentation in the first place. I'd like to make a few other comments before concluding. One question that's often asked is, how many CE credits should a presenter request in his or her application. And the guideline is that there should be 1 credit hour requested for each hour of presentation. Also, half credits can be requested. So, for example, one can request 3.5 hours of CE credit if you're offering 3.5 hours of material at a workshop. I would add that lunches and coffee breaks don't count toward the approvable time. A second comment that I would make is that if the CE committee doesn't approve an application, this doesn't mean that the material is not meritorious. It only means that the workshop is not deemed to be approvable under current CE guidelines. We see applications that are extremely worthwhile and that we as committee members would enjoy going to, but for one reason or another, the material doesn't fit under CE guidelines and therefore can't be approved. So one should not take disapproval of an application as a comment on the worthiness of the material to be presented. The third and final point that I would make is that once your application is approved, and the day of the presentation arrives, be sure to have with you sign-in and sign-out sheets that the NISPA central office has provided you. And be sure to have the participants sign them whenever they're signing in and signing out. Participants need to do so in order for them to receive certificates of CE attendance from NISPA. It's understandably extremely disappointing for a participant to attend a workshop and then not be able to receive credit for it because the presenter forgot to bring with them the sign-in and sign-out sheets, or brought them with them but forgot to implement them and have the attendees actually sign them. So please be sure at the actual workshop to use the sign-in and sign-out sheets. This concludes our webinar. I hope that you found it to be informative and helpful. And I and the CE committee wish you success in your CE submissions and presentations. Thank you.